If you want to understand whether morality is objective or not, the single most important term you need to define is to specify exactly what you mean by objective. Otherwise, you're opening yourself up to all kinds of confusion and equivocation. So it's telling that the term objective is the one thing that Dr. Craig don't define whenever he's talking about objective moral values. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on the book On Guard by Dr. William Lane Craig. We've been working our way through Dr. Craig's presentation of the so-called moral argument for God and has just finished his attempt at defending premise 1, which states that objective moral values and duties can't exist without God. Unfortunately, he ain't never defined exactly what he means by objective moral values and duties, which makes it kinda hard to say whether or not a God would actually be required. The only time he used the actual standard meaning of the word objective was when he was arguing that the whole concept of truly objective moral values and duties is incoherent, and that kinda makes the whole question pretty much irrelevant. Or at least it would if Dr. Craig was using a consistent, well-defined meaning for what objective moral values and duties is supposed to be. And he ain't doing that. He's using the term objective in sloppy, inconsistent, and undefined ways that blur the distinction between values and duties that arise by social consensus and values and duties that's imposed by God. And he may or may not be doing that on purpose, but it's definitely the case that his argument is more persuasive to folks if he avoids a consistent, well-defined meaning for what objective morals is supposed to be. So intentional or not, he's got a pretty strong motivation to keep his meaning sloppy and ill-defined. And that brings us to today's topic, which is premise 2, the claim that objective moral values and duties do exist. Which that's going to be a difficult claim to address if we can't know for sure what he means by objective moral values and duties. And I'm sure that's a feature, not a bug, at least from his perspective. But on the other hand, even without knowing what he actually means by objective moral values and duties, and even if he ain't entirely clear himself on what it's supposed to mean, we at least have the information that he's given us in premise 1, and that gives us enough to work with. Premise 1 states that objective moral values and duties can't exist without God. So regardless of what the phrase might mean in a general context, we can say that in the context of Dr. Craig's argument, an objective moral value or duty has to be something that can't exist without God. In other words, regardless of how objective moral values and duties might be defined in a secular context, as far as Dr. Craig's argument is concerned, we can declare that if in some particular moral value or duty don't necessarily require a God, then it definitely ain't whatever Dr. Craig means by an objective moral value or duty. He's kind of fuzzy on what objective morals is, but he's clear and unambiguous concerning what one ain't. So we can positively assert that whatever arises from social consensus, human empathy, and/or a consideration of the consequences must be a moral value or duty that ain't what Dr. Craig means by objective. If it don't require a God, then it can't be what he means. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and hear what Dr. Craig has to say in defense of his second premise. Quote, "It might surprise you to learn that surveys taken at universities reveal, perhaps contrary to impression, that professors are more apt to believe in objective moral values than students, and that philosophy professors are more apt to believe in objective moral values than professors in general." End quote. And here we see the tactical advantage of failing to precisely define the single most important term in the whole argument. By leaving the phrase objective moral values undefined, Dr. Craig is giving himself a tremendous amount of leeway regarding what he does or does not regard as indicating belief in objective moral values. If in the surveys he mentioned had defined objective moral values as being specifically those moral values that can only exist if in Dr. Craig's personal favorite flavor of deity is the one true God, then I guarantee you that the majority of professors in philosophy or in general ain't gonna be signing on. And we know that because back when he was talking about premise one, he discussed what a lot of secular college professors believe. He called it atheistic moral Platonism, and he argued that not only do no such moral values exist, but that the whole concept is incoherent. And yet here he is now in premise two, trying to use those same Platonic values to prove that objective moral values do exist, even though he just got done arguing that they don't. He knows that professors ain't talking about whatever he means by objective moral values, but because he ain't being specific about what he means, he's going to include them anyway, as if they was support for his argument. Now, is he doing that on purpose, or is he just falling victim to his own sloppy thinking? I can't say for sure, but I tend to think it's the sloppy thinking. He ain't trying to get to the truth, he's trying to arrive at a predetermined conclusion. And being sloppy about what constitutes support and evidence is just a convenient way to get where he wants to go. So I'd be more likely to call this negligence and not any kind of malicious dishonesty. And by the way, let's talk for a minute about objective morality using business prices as an illustration. As you know, sellers want to sell for high prices and buyers want to buy for low prices. And if the price is too high, buyers ain't going to buy at all. And that's subjective. Each person has their own opinion about the actual value of the product relative to the price and whether or not it's actually worth buying. Meanwhile, the business has to decide how much to charge. They're going to sell more products if they set the price low, but they ain't going to make as much profit. And on the other hand, if they set the price high, the profit per item's going to be higher, but they ain't going to sell as many. And there's studies and calculations you can do to figure out what price is going to move the greatest possible volume at the best possible price. And that optimum selling price is going to be an objective value, even though you're studying the subjective value judgments of the customers. Things that's subjective at the level of the individual can produce objective values when you consider the population as a whole. And something very similar happens with other value judgments like morality. Just like business is a trade-off between what the seller wants to charge and what the buyer's willing to pay, morality is a trade-off between prioritizing your own interests and prioritizing the interests of others. This is a gross oversimplification, of course, but you get the general idea. Large numbers of folks operating out of subjective self-interests in a civilized society is going to produce patterns that can be objectively tuned for optimal outcomes. And philosophers can try and recognize these patterns and predict which course of action is going to give us the best results, both individually and collectively. And this optimal course of action is going to be something you could call objective morality. So philosophers who's wrestling with that problem is going to be doing something worthwhile, and it's going to have a ton of job security because of how complicated and dynamic it all is. And the point of all this is that it ain't too surprising to find college philosophy professors pursuing what might be called objective morality, even though that ain't at all what Dr. Craig means by objective morality. There's objective, real-world concerns here that's worth the attention of college professors without the need for any gods. So right off the bat, Dr. Craig's first example of supposed evidence for objective morality ain't even talking about whatever he means by objective morality. So the second premise is still unsupported. Let's see if his next example does any better. Quote, "My senses are not infallible, but that doesn't lead me to think that there is no external world around me. Similarly, in the absence of some reason to distrust my moral experience, I should accept what it tells me, namely, that some things are objectively good or evil, right or wrong." End quote. So, two problems here. One is that if and it was true that some things was just objectively right or objectively wrong by their very nature, then that ain't going to match Dr. Craig's standard that he set in premise one. If and it's possible for things to be inherently right or inherently wrong, that don't require any God, because the rightness or wrongness is inherent in the thing itself. So what Dr. Craig claims as his personal moral experience is actually a contradiction of his first premise. But the bigger problem here is that personal moral experience ain't like personal perception of objective reality. When we perceive objective reality, the reality we perceive is the same for everybody, independent of our perceptions of it. And that means both that our perceptions is going to have a lot in common right from the get-go, because we has a common frame of reference, and also that we has a way to detect and correct for any misperceptions that may arise as a result of the fallibility of our senses. And that ain't true at all for moral perceptions. I mean, sure, morals is fundamentally based on human empathy and a desire to get along with other folks without being harassed or canceled. And since most folks has that as a common goal, there's going to be a number of moral perceptions that's widespread. But what objective reality has that moral perceptions don't is the ability to detect and correct our misperceptions. And that's why you're also going to find conflicts between one person's moral experience and another's. We got that going on in the United States right now. The MAGA folks thinks that it's wrong to allow gay folks to get married, and it's wrong to allow immigrants to come into the country, and some of them is even saying that it's wrong to allow women to vote. And if anybody disagrees with them, they's quote-unquote woke, which is supposed to be a bad thing even though it's based on moral principles like justice and compassion and tolerance for harmless differences. It'd be hard to find two moral experiences that's more diametrically opposed, and there ain't no objective measure that both sides can use that will prove to everybody's satisfaction who's objectively right and who's objectively wrong. Granted, Dr. Craig's going to try and claim that the Bible is supposed to be the objective standard that definitively answers all moral questions. But that's a straight up scam because believers themselves don't get their morals from the Bible. Ask a Christian today if slavery's okay since the Bible endorses it, and they'll tell you the Bible don't endorse it. But how do they know that the Bible don't endorse it? Well, they knows because the Bible's supposed to be the perfect moral authority, which means that whatever the Bible teaches has to align with what the believer perceives to be the correct moral opinion. And modern believers think that slavery's wrong. So it ends up being the believer's moral opinions that dictate the interpretation of the Bible, and not the Bible that dictates the believer's moral opinions. And when you get a bunch of believers together sharing similar opinions, then they tend to take that as confirmation that they's getting it right, and they give the Bible credit for being the objective moral authority, which is basically the mistake that Dr. Craig is making here. He's confusing peer approval with objectivity. And he gives us a helpful example that he thinks proves that morality is objective when it actually proves just the opposite. Quote, "When I was speaking several years ago on a Canadian university campus, I noticed a poster put up by the Sexual Assault and Information Center. It read, 'Sexual assault. No one has the right to abuse a child, woman, or man.' Most of us recognize that sexual abuse of another person is wrong." End quote. And I'm glad he brought up that example, because if he hadn't, I'd have probably brought it up myself. And the reason it's important is because forced pregnancy is sexual abuse. It's the use of violence or the threat of violence to gain control of someone else's genitals without their consent, and to use them in a way that degrades them and causes them to suffer physically, mentally, and emotionally, and may even put their life or their health in danger. And that is the definition of sexual abuse. And thing is, that's also the pro-life movement. It's an organized effort to inflict forced pregnancy on innocent women under the pretext of caring about the unborn. And regardless of your opinion about whether or not a fertilized egg and a baby is the same thing, it don't change the fact that forced pregnancy is sexual abuse. So not only is it untrue that everybody knows sexual abuse is always wrong, but it's folks like Dr. Craig who's defending sexual abuse as being God's divine moral mandate in the case of unplanned pregnancies. That ain't some kind of objective morality that everybody experiences in common. That's a cultural and largely political consensus being advocated by Christian supremacists. They's just calling it objective in order to disclaim any responsibility or accountability for promoting the abuse. Plus, of course, it also gives them a pretext for demonizing anybody who disagrees with them. It's God's moral law, so y'all woke folks is just sinners. But, of course, it don't require any particular God in order for folks to have moral experiences like that. Ordinary sexism, bigotry, and puritanism is sufficient to generate the misogyny behind the abuse. Moving on, Dr. Craig says that he can get most folks to agree with objective morality. But again, he consistently uses examples that don't require any God and which therefore don't qualify as being the kind of objective moral values that he needs for his first and second premise. Quote, ask what they think of the Hindu practice of sutter, burning widows alive on the funeral pyres of their husbands, or the ancient Chinese custom of crippling women for life by tightly binding their feet from childhood to resemble lotus blossoms. End quote. And of course, most folks who ain't ancient Hindus or Chinese is going to say that these customs is barbaric and cruel. The thing is, the fact that folks feels that way ain't any great mystery. We learn at a pretty young age that we can predict how other folks is going to respond to our actions just by thinking, well, how would I respond if somebody did that to me? And because humans is a social species with strong empathy for one another, folks can easily judge right and wrong just by imagining how it would feel to be on the receiving end. The fact that most folks would rather not be crippled and burned alive is entirely understandable and predictable. No God required. But now Dr. Craig is really smiling because he has an expert gotcha all set up and ready to go. Quote, ask them what they think of the Crusades or the Inquisition. Ask them if they think it's all right for Catholic priests to sexually abuse little boys and for the church to try and cover it up. If you're dealing with someone who's an honest inquirer, I can guarantee that almost every time that person will agree that there are objective moral values and duties. End quote. Woo, did you feel that one? If you don't agree that objective moral values exist, then you can't criticize Christianity for all the evils done in the name of God. Checkmate, atheists! Except, of course, that once again, he's using examples of moral perceptions that don't require any God in order to exist. We don't need any God in order for us to know that we wouldn't like to be murdered by soldiers or tortured by priests just because we supposedly believed in the wrong religion. We don't need any God to know that we wouldn't want to be sexually abused as a child. Yes, you'll find widespread agreement that these things is wrong because most folks has enough empathy to understand how they would feel if and they was subjected to the same kind of treatment. It's also the case that murder and torture and abuse is all things that has objective negative consequences for the victims and their families. So in that sense, you could say that there's an objective basis for the perception that these things is wrong. But since you can say that even without any God, the fact that you say it don't mean that there's any such thing as moral values that require a God to exist. So Dr. Craig still ain't demonstrated that his second premise, taken in context with the first, has any merit. Well, he's got one last gotcha, this time in reply to a panelist in a discussion about the biblical prohibitions against homosexuality. Quote, one panelist dismissed biblical prohibitions of such activity on the grounds that they reflect the cultural context in which they were written. End quote. And let me just interrupt here real quick to point out that this is exactly the same way that apologists like Dr. Craig dismiss the Bible's endorsement of slavery. Well, let's continue. Quote, since this is the case for all of Scripture's commands, he concluded that there are no timeless normative moral truths in Scripture. End quote. And I think that's a fair conclusion. Dr. Craig himself don't think that every biblical injunction is a timeless normative moral truth. For example, I don't reckon he'd claim that men today is under any moral obligation to get their brother's widow pregnant if and he dies before having a son, like it commands in Deuteronomy 25. The Bible reflects the culture in which it was written, not some kind of eternal, unchanging divine mandate. But Dr. Craig has a gotcha for this one, too. Quote, I pointed out that such a view leads to sociocultural relativism, which makes it impossible to criticize any society's moral values, including those of a society that persecutes homosexuals. End quote. And this is what's known as being so sharp that you cut yourself. If and we accept Dr. Craig's claim that sociocultural relativism makes it impossible to criticize any society, then can't nobody say that it's wrong for our society to be critical of homophobic societies neither. He tried to catch us on the horns of a dilemma, but instead he just ruled out the dilemma. The reality of the situation is that, of course, we can criticize homophobic cultures, both ancient and modern, while also recognizing that ancient homophobia was an artifact of ancient bigotry rather than being an actual divine prohibition. We don't need some kind of special permission to reevaluate ancient assumptions in the light of our modern understanding. And besides, the fact that Christians describe God as a same-sex union between three male persons ought to be enough to tell you that God ain't the one who gets his undies in a bunch over same-sex unions. I mean, of course, Christians don't use the term same-sex union to describe God, but the doctrine of the Trinity does describe God as a union and does assign the male gender to all three persons. So you can't really deny that God is a same-sex union without also denying the Trinity. Anyways, that about wraps it up for Dr. Craig's attempt to prove his claim that objective moral values and duties do exist. He gave a bunch of examples of widespread moral consensus based on human empathy and social awareness, but every single example he used was a moral perception that folks is going to have regardless of whether there's any God or not. And since Dr. Craig's argument depends on finding objective moral values that can't exist unless God exists, his argument fails. The moral values that human folks share is moral values they'd still share even if God showed up in person and declared that he didn't care one way or t'other anymore and folks could do whatever they like. With or without any God putting in his 2 cents worth, humans is a social species with empathy for one another and an awareness that their own individual flourishing is most likely when humanity as a whole is flourishing. And that's going to drive everything else that we call morality. And I'm sure there's more that could be said, but that's going to about do it for me for today. Next time, Dr. Craig is going to try and answer some objections to his moral argument, or at least he's going to try and distract attention from the flaws in it. So that'll be fun. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.